So if we want to add some internationalization to our book list index view, we can do that by using the translate method. But we also need to provide the key value pairs. So the first thing that we want to look at is the application module. Underneath the language folder, you'll notice that there's already a bunch of .mo and .po files already out here. For example, we have an English one and we have a Spanish one that contain some basic message ID and message strings for all of the different Zend skeleton application keys that they've already set up by default. So to add the translation functionality, you can either specify the key value pairs first or specify the translation area first and then put in the key value. So I'm actually going to go over to our book list and I'm going to look at the index view. And you can see we have some static text here such as title and author, which are not going to be translated because it's just static HTML. So what we're going to do is add some translation for these. And we're first going to start by printing out the translate echo function that Zend provides. So I'm going to start first by replacing the title. So here I'm changing the static text to use the title translated text. Even though I'm passing title in here, this is actually the key value now and not the actual printed value. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for our author, and that takes care of the title and author. So now that we have two keys, title and author, we need to add that to our translation bundles. As you can see, I have a translation bundle PO file for my English, and it's mainly just plain text here. The problem is, when I save this file, my current editor is not going to actually create the compiled down MO file for me. And so that's why you want to use a tool such as PO Edit. This is what PO Edit looks like on my operating system, and the Windows version and the other versions look very similar as well. Essentially, you have source text, and if you select one, you can see that we have the key and then a translation value here. The one thing that you do want to make sure it is set on the PO Edit is in the preferences, there is an area that specifies whether it creates the .mo file on save or not. And if I go over to the editor preference, you can see that I have automatically compile the .mo file on save, which means that when I add keys and values, it's going to update my .mo file as well, which we do want since the Zend translator actually uses the mo file. You can think of an mo file as essentially a PO file that's been compiled down. MO often stands to machine object, which is a compiled or binary version of the source that it comes from. So the overall process for creating a translation file in Zend is going to be that we create the PO file, which is human readable text. We then need to compile that into an MO file, and that MO file will be used by the Zend Framework to display the text for that particular translation. The MO file will simply speed up and improve performance with our internationalization efforts. So before I save my English PO file, I'm actually going to go over back to my editor and just add my new title and author keys to my English and Spanish versions. So I'll just come down to the bottom. I'm going to copy one. I'll call this author. You can also reference the view that it lives in as a comment. If this is something that helps you keep track of where things are, then that's great, you can do that. Otherwise, you don't have to add one on here. So maybe that's important to you, maybe it's not. Probably not a bad idea to add that. If I don't add a message string translation, it's just going to use the actual method key. But to keep things consistent, I'm just going to add author as the message string. And same thing for title. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is copy my ID and string over into my Spanish translation file. And here I want to create the Spanish equivalent of author and title for the message string, but I want to keep the message ID the same. So even though my Spanish is a little rusty, I think I can make these particular translations work. So author is autor and title is título. And we'll go ahead and save these files. Now we need to go back to PO edit and save them from there and validate them, because that will actually create our .mo file. So if I come down, you'll see that I have a new author and a new title inside of here. So I'm just going to validate this. We didn't see any problems, and then I'm going to save this. And that'll actually update my MO file. Then we need to do the same thing for our Spanish file. So I'm going to go ahead and open that catalog. You can see here is our new key, author, and title with our translation. We'll validate this. Everything's okay. Go ahead and save this now to update our MO file. We can go ahead and close out PO edit now since we are done with our translations. Back in our view now, when this is called, translate is now going to look at the locale that's set and try to update the title and author text here based off of the translation that we've been given. Before we test this out, I want to point out two things in the configuration of the translation module. Over in application, you have your config module.config.php. Inside of here, if you go from the top down to where it specifies the service manager, you'll notice that we have some factories, and underneath there is a translator. And the translator is getting all of the MO files out of the language folder in our application module. But the real important thing you want to keep track of is the default locale that's being used by our Zend application is currently US English. I could change the application's locale here globally to say Spanish, but what we really want to do is make sure that whatever our browser passes us, we will use that instead of the default. If we went and tested out our application and we set the locale in our browser to Spanish, it's not going to actually translate that for us yet because of this line right here saying the default locale for our Zend application is currently English. So how do we update that? We need to go over to our module.php file in our application module. Inside of this module, there is an event that happens. So when our application is bootstrapped, this event gets fired and we get a callback into this function. This is where we want to set up the actual browser locales based off of what's going on our requests and our HTTP accept headers. So I'm just going to add at the bottom of this function. So this looks kind of strange because I have my font enlarged and it's kind of moving on to the next line. But let's talk about what's happening here. First, we're getting a hold of the translator object that was configured in our module.config.php. That's what we just looked at underneath our service factories. Once we get a hold of that, instead of using the default now, we're actually going to set the locale based off of our HTTP accept language header. If, for some reason, we don't have that, we can set the fallback locale back to English. So all that's left now is to just go and test out our application. Make sure that our locales are really working. So I'm going to go back to my Chrome browser, which is set to use English, and I'm just going to refresh the page and make sure that our title and author still shows as we would expect to in English. Everything seems okay there. Now, if I move over to Firefox, you can see that I actually have my preferences set to use Spanish first, and then if for some reason that doesn't work, we can fall back to English or just default Spanish. But this Spanish locale should work now because we're passing it in and the browser is going to set that on our HTTP accept language header. So if I go ahead and refresh now, we should see some changes to our title and author and the rest of our application that is currently using Spanish translations. So first off, you'll notice that our title and author changed to Spanish. You'll also notice that there are some other text on here that changed to Spanish too. And those are translations that were put in by our Zend application. And as we go about doing things, you'll want to make sure, if you're translating this whole page, we'd have our header that we'd have to deal with, we have our breadcrumb navigation bar, we have all sorts of things that we'd have to deal with. But that gives you an idea of what it takes to set up translation and get that working.